I'm going to introduce you to our guest. I'm going to show you some of his photos while I'm doing this. Ed Kashi is an acclaimed photojournalist, which is an understatement. He is so thoroughly acclaimed that he's won all sorts of awards. He uses photography to explore social issues that define our times. He's also a dedicated educator and mentor to photographers around the world, which is why he's back with us on AYP Live. Ed, welcome to the show. It's great to have you.
Hello. Good to see you, Mark. Thank you for having me.
What is your passion behind photography? What is it that gets you out of bed and drives you to pick up a camera and tell those stories?
I'm driven by a desire to engage with the world. It also connects to my passions for, politics, geopolitics, social issues, my desire to learn about the world. I have an incurable curiosity about things. So, for me, those are the elements that sort of, when I wake up, I'm like driven to try to figure out what stories can I tell, what issues can I engage with. And that's really been the case for about 3 or 4 decades now.
Well, I think, probably the best way to do this is I'm going to bring up the images that you sent me. We're starting with the girl in Vietnam, and I know we talked about these before. You have a lot of advocacy journalism that you do, and I know this was part of that, but could you tell us about this girl in Vietnam?
Yeah,
That
and so
photograph.
absolutely, and with advocacy work, it's something I'm doing more and more of, certainly in the last like 5 or 10 years. It's really about it's working in exactly the same mode as you would for a magazine or a newspaper, or a personal project for that matter. But that there's an edge to it. There's a real point that you're trying to shine a light on an issue to facilitate change, or at least be
Right.
part of change. I'm too humble to think that anything I do is directly related to creating change. But I do know from experience that not only myself, but some of my colleagues have been a part of tremendous change through the stories that we tell and the photographs we've made. So with this picture, this was taken in Da Nang in Vietnam, and it was part of the Vietnam reporting project, which actually emanated out of San Francisco in 2010. The idea was for each of us to come up with a theme, with a story around Agent Orange. And so I decided to look at the enduring impact of Agent Orange, which is that even today, babies in Vietnam, and even probably grandkids or great grandkids of American veterans of the war in Vietnam, are being born with certain disabilities or health issues. So I decided to go to Da Nang. I worked with an American organization, Children of Vietnam, based in North Carolina. And they hooked me up with a couple of families, and this young girl was in one of the families, and she had been born with these, deformities or whatever you want to, these disabilities. But she is this shining light, beautiful, intelligent, tremendous energy. And I had been outside, and I walked into her house, and what you see is exactly what I saw.
That's an
And it
amazing
was,
image.
yeah, as I say, the photo gods were like, okay, Ed, here's one. Basically, don't screw it up, right? No.
Really?
And I'm honored to have been a part of this effort, because ultimately it was used to get the U.S. Congress to allocate millions of dollars to the government in Vietnam to clean up a remaining hotspot of Agent Orange in Vietnam. Here's a key element to doing advocacy work, which is that to have great partners. So
Yeah.
I might have, I was fortunate enough to create a story, and in this case, a photograph that was powerful. But it was the organization that I was working with who was able to lobby Congress in Washington, D.C., who had the connections. And this was through Ford Foundation money. So this is really important. Now, there are a handful of photographers who have done it all,
Yeah.
that have not only created great photography and great stories, but they're fierce in the way they've created their own NGOs or their own foundations. And, Donna Ferrato is a great example of that. Stephanie Sinclair with Too Young to Wed. There's a number of photographers who have not only done the storytelling, but have also created the infrastructure to have those stories facilitate change.
Right.
In my case, I'm a storyteller. I have the heart of an activist, but I am not an activist in the sense of, knowing where to go to who to talk to and all that. So
Yeah.
just a really important point in doing advocacy work is choose your collaborators wisely.
It's a partnership.
Exactly.
That's a good point. Choose them wisely.
Yeah.
Let's look at the next one.
This is part of an ongoing project, a personal project. I'm in my 7th year. This is a project looking at chronic kidney disease of unknown origins.
Uh-huh.
And I've now worked in 5 countries over the last 7 years: Nicaragua, El Salvador, India, Sri Lanka, and Peru.
Tell me about some of the specifics, like the technical side of this photograph. What did you capture it with? Do you remember? It's a fairly wide lens, right? I mean, it's 35 or something.
Yeah, so my kit is generally like a 5D. That was probably with a Mark III. I work with a Mark IV now, but
Yeah.
Canon 5D. And then my favorite lens is the 24-105. I like to work light because I want to be fleet-footed. I want to be able to move and get in and out of situations. I don't want to have a big footprint. As
Yeah.
it is, I'm relatively tall. It's going to be hard for me not to stand out, but as much as possible, I like to work in this very light touch. And
Yeah.
so having one camera and one lens is my preferred method of working when I'm shooting stills. Photography is about all these variables that we work with. And I want to limit the variables so that, as you say, I can just focus on what is in front of me. And in a sense, obviously I'm not the first person to say this. I wish it could just be embedded in my eye or in my head. But
We're headed
short
that
of
way.
short of that, which would be kind of weird,
Yeah.
that it's really about finding a setup that allows you to work as effortlessly as possible. So, as you sort of rightly said, in a sense, the camera disappears.
This is so important because unlike what you'll see on a lot of other YouTube channels that are kind of pushing you in the opposite direction, again, we're talking with working photographers here who do have to keep things simple, but eliminating the variables in that little phrase, Ed, is such a massive amount of power in terms of putting your attention on what you really should be putting it on, which is making the photograph. So eliminating the variables.
You don't want the equipment to get in the way of the human connection.
Absolutely.
It's super important.
Okay, cool. Well, let's look at this next one.
And this is part of my massive project on aging in America that I did with my wife, Julie Winokur. This was actually the very first story that we did as part of the project, which was looking at aging prisoners.
What I see interesting about this, Ed, Deanne Fitzmaurice, I believe you know her too.
Of course.
Yeah. So she talked about, frames within frames and how oftentimes you can take one image and you could split it into, 3 or more photographs. And that's what I see here. Because you have the guy on the right, he's in his own frame. You have the 2 guys in the background, they're kind of in their own frame. And then you have the guys on the left. And then you even have the window, the reflection, of whatever the trees behind it. But is that something you strive for? I mean, in terms of, what you're looking for in an image?
Yeah, well, in general, I like layered imagery. That's generally what I strive for. The first 2 images were examples of more, simpler compositions, a single person in the frame, even though there were layers to those images as well. But in this case, this is a good example of a more complex layered image where it's not only layered foreground, middle ground, background, but it's layered, horizontally, if you like, across the frame. And that is, I realize sometimes I'll finish I'll finish with a scene or and I'll realize like I never did a simple shot, because all I was looking for was that complex shot. And then sometimes I'm thinking, oh man, I might have missed the essence because I was so consumed with trying to make a complex image. And what's interesting working in a lot of video is it's sort of, I've evolved in that sense, because when you work in video and film, you've got to get details.
Right.
You've got to get tight shots. You've got to get wide shots and sense of place images. I always, when I teach about photography and the language of narrative photography, I talk about kind of 4 basic images. And, my God, this is not like a biblical, from the mount here. It's just what I see from not only my own work, but what I've seen having been obsessed with photography for more than 40 years now. And in narrative photography, you basically have environmental portraits, the sense of place or landscape, the detail, and the candid moment. And within those 4 kinds of images, and please understand, folks, you do whatever you want and take those 4 ideas and break them and mess with them. But would
you repeat that again, just so we really got it? The 4.
Yeah. So we'll start. The landscape or sense of place.
Okay.
That could be a room. It could be a landscape like a monumental scene like Ansel Adams.
Yeah.
It can have people. It doesn't have to have people, but it's that idea of, it could be a street scene, the sense of place. Establish, what does it look like where you are?
Right.
Then there's the candid moment, which is what I love taking the most, which is that, unadulterated, no direction, no footprint of the photographer. Maybe our visual voice might be in it, but basically we have not directed, we have not moved anything, and it's just capturing the magic moments.
Yeah.
Then there's the environmental portrait. That's the only picture as a photojournalist where ethically you're allowed to direct. You're allowed to, move the subject. You're allowed to tell them, smile or frown or look to the left, right? That's
Annie Leibovitz as an example, or Richard Avedon. Yeah.
Yeah, and the environmental portrait can say so much, if you really make a great one. And then the last image or type of image is the detail. And that, for me, in many ways, is the toughest image. That's the toughest image for me to see, because it could be anything. It could be something hanging on the wall. It could be an assemblage of items on a table in your subject's house. And what's interesting, as I've learned with the detail image, is the older I've gotten, or the more experience I've gotten in life, not just in photography, I actually see more meaning in things. Like as I become more educated, that that religious symbol on the wall now, maybe 20, 30 years ago, I had no idea what it meant. Right. Now I understand what it means. And so then that means these inanimate objects become imbued with more meaning. And so the challenge is, how do you make a beautiful, powerful, interesting image of objects? But when you approach a narrative, this is about narrative photography, linear photography. I'm not talking about conceptual work. That's a totally different kind of. When you're trying to be a visual storyteller, to me, those 4 images are like the building blocks of a narrative.
That's fantastic. Is there any final advice you'd like to leave our viewers with in terms of upping their game as photographers?
I want to answer that question in 2 ways. In the current moment, please be safe and be careful. Don't take any undue risks. You can still photograph. Photograph in your home. My gosh, this is a great moment to develop those, not only the skills of photographing in your own home, but often we say that the hardest things to photograph are what we're closest to.
Right.
And so here's a challenge for you. Try to photograph your friends, your family, whoever you're around. But it's also go out, and when you go on those walks or you go on a bike ride or whatever, as long as you're doing it safely and you're keeping your social distance, there's so much to photograph. So, that's something I would advise. Now, when this is finally over, because we will prevail, this will be over, my advice to you is find what stirs your passions. That's always going to be the greatest source of your work. What do you care about?
Brilliant. Ed, thanks again. You know,
All right.
I really appreciate having you back on the show. We probably will want to do it again because I know you got a lot more to talk about, and I certainly
All
have more
right.
questions. So be well. I'll ping you later after the show.
All right. Take care, man. Be well.
Okay. Thanks a
Be
lot.
well, everyone.
Subscribe if you haven't already done that. Enable the bell. Share this video. Share it when it comes out. Like it. Leave your comments. I love you guys. Thank you for joining us. And remember to get out and capture your own images of life.